Hello again, and welcome to Denton's Tales. We now continue the story of the goddess Hel, more important in Old Norse religion than one might think today, but dreadfully misrepresented in most books and YouTube videos, seen as a partly rotting corpse or a deformed hag, for which there is absolutely no basis in Old Norse religion. The thumbnail to this video shows a proper representation of her. A fine drawing from 1889 entitled Hel by the German artist Johannes Gertz, showing her as a rather statuesque woman with her hound Garma. I salute you, Herr Gertz, for getting it right, unlike the majority of your fellow artists who didn't. It must be borne in mind that the Eddas come from Iceland, and just because something may have been true in Iceland does not mean that it was true everywhere else, and the same could be said of Saxo in Denmark, or that if it was true for the entire period of Old Norse history. It's more than possible that there were differing forms of the Old Norse religion, say between Iceland and Denmark, or between Sweden and settlements in Ireland, just as there are very differing forms of Christianity, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, dozens of Protestant sects, and there are differing forms of Judaism as well as two variations of Islam. So the same is quite possible to have been the case among the Norse people, since we know very little about the actual details of the worship of the Norse gods, the actual ceremonies and so forth. So differing versions of the same thing found in the Eddas or various sagas might well all be correct, or correct at different periods in history or different geographical locations, apart from the obvious alterations made by Snorri. Religions can change over periods of time, as we see with Christianity, which is quite different in many ways today from what it was in, say, the 13th century or the 16th century. Then, of course, there are the traditions handed down in Scandinavian folklore from one generation to another that might even be closer to the truth. I've seen the death of Balder also mentioned in the context of who went where when they died, in that despite his dying in a brutal manner, he went to Hel rather than Valhall. But, I don't see it that way. For one thing, though he met a violent end, struck down by a piece of mistletoe thrown by the blind god Hodor at the instigation of Loki, he was not killed in battle. He didn't die in combat with a weapon in his hand, and thus I would see his death as accidental, though it was a contrived accident, which would make him one of Hel's subjects as I see it. I don't think he qualified for that free ride by a Valkyrie. He wasn't a warrior killed in battle. But of course, going by the sagas and old poems, you could simply say Baldur went to Hel because he was dead, and dead people, gods included, went there. Hel having been given authority over all the dead, not just some of them, even if in many cases that was temporary, such as warriors perhaps moving on to Valhall. But Christianity, plays an important part in all of this, since it is Christians who bring most of our knowledge of the Norse gods down to us, their version of it at least. So that even very old poems or sagas that were told verbally long before Christian times, sometimes maybe hundreds of years before Christian times, were still recorded in Christian times and influenced to greater or lesser degrees by that fact. It's pretty obvious that Snorri considerably exaggerated Hel's unpleasantness, for example, to bring it more in line with the Christian vision of Hel as a thoroughly nasty place. And it makes his interpretation of the pagan version seem a sort of vision of the future Christian ideas, making it more acceptable perhaps to those of his own time, such as Hel sleeping in a bed called illness, eating from a dish called hunger with a knife named famine, the curtains that hung in her abode called bleak misfortune, the threshold of her doorway known as the stumbling block, as well as having servants named slow and lazy, who move so slowly that nobody can see them move. You look away, look back. Oh, they moved at least half an inch, and so forth. There's no mention of that anywhere else. That's pure Snorri, and so gloriously over the top, so wonderfully exaggerated that it's positively funny. He's putting so much effort into making her as evil and miserable and gloomy as possible. But of course that seems to contradict her welcoming feasts for honoured arrivals, as well as Odin's instructions to her when he sent her to Niflheim to begin with, telling her to provide for those sent into her care. He doesn't tell her to make them bloody miserable while she's at it, nor to hire servants who are so damn slow they're completely useless. If Hell had ordered a hot meal, it would have had mold growing on it by the time she got it. The contradictions in Snorri's stories are glaringly obvious, very much so in the case of Hel. Now, it is also Snorri who tells us of the Valkyries actually bringing warriors to Osgard to feast with the gods in Valhall, though Valkyries themselves are mentioned in many of the old stories, and so that has been questioned as to its truthfulness. Did they pick up warriors and take them aloft? It seems to me that there was nothing to be gained from a Christian viewpoint by his making that up, unlike making hell seem much worse than it actually was, since there was no perception in Christian belief for warriors getting special treatment in heaven. It didn't make any difference if you were a warrior or not. It was pious behavior and being very nice to the church that got you a good seat in heaven. The most woeful sinner could gain entry to heaven if they paid enough money to the church. It would have been pointless for Snorri to invent that. Were he going to embellish something for Christian consumption, he would surely have had good, pious people being taken aloft to Osgard as a reward for their goodness, not warriors, since that would have fitted the Christian viewpoint. Be good and you'll get up there. And of course, we must also consider the fact that despite his Christian leanings, he was near enough to those times, only about 200 years after Iceland converted to Christianity, that he could have known some old person whose grandfather or grandmother told them something that their grandfather had told them, a tale perhaps never written down. And as I've said, there are a number of references in the sagas to Valkyries on the battlefield, choosing who lived and who died. So we know that the Valkyries were indeed part of Norse religious belief. Taking all that into consideration, I'm inclined to accept Snorri's account of them to be simply perhaps a variation of genuine Norse belief. He may have moved Valhall skywards to Osgard, since it has been suggested that originally it was somewhere in Hell itself, given the mentions of warriors in Hell and the meaning of the name Valhall, and moving it up. Now that would fit a Christian concept of some kind, the reward in the afterlife being up there in heaven. And of course, if you want to keep the image of Valhall in Hell, well, the Valkyries in that case could just as easily have assisted warriors to go there, wherever it happened to be. They are actually mentioned in one poem as being ready to ride to the earth, suggesting that indeed they did come down from somewhere, presumably Osgard. The sagas and the poems of the Poetic Edda, as well as Saxo's writing, agree with Snorri on some things connected with Hell. The river with the bridge across it on the road to Hell, the Hell Gate, for example, but they differ wildly on others. Saxo paints Hell as a green and pleasant realm with pretty flowers growing in it, recounting in his Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, how the hero Hudding passes through sunny, fertile regions where herbs grow, encountering armies of fallen warriors engaged in eternal battle, whereas Snorri says it's dark and foreboding, a place of misery and everlasting despair, one being what seems to be the correct Old Norse version, the other clearly adapted to fit Christian ideas of a good place, heaven, and a bad place, hell. But Snorri is still a great source of information, of course, on various aspects of the Norse peoples, just as long as you keep in mind that religious topics have been doctored to greater or lesser extent, whereas the poems in the Poetic Edda, many of the sagas, and the work of Saxo have not been altered to the same extent, or probably even at all in some cases where there was no religious conflict with Christian teachings. When it's purely historical or social, these things have probably not been altered. I can understand and sympathize with Snorri Sturluson because he clearly had a respect and liking for the old ways. Obviously, he wasn't a highly prejudiced Christian who regarded anything pagan as the evil work of Satan, or he wouldn't have written the prose Edda in the first place, or he would have added even more lurid things to it. He wanted to preserve the traditions of the Old Norse poets to show future writers how to follow in their footsteps. But he would have had to be rather careful in doing that. He couldn't praise the old gods in glowing terms, or he would have attracted unfavorable attention to himself. The conversion of many Norse territories was due in no small measure to extreme brutality by the likes of King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, who helped people to change their faith by torturing or killing them. and destroying pagan temples and images, which is inclined to work quite well. And Iceland had been Christian for 200 years by Snorri's time, so that faith was firmly established, and it wouldn't have looked kindly on anyone rocking the boat, so to speak. This was getting well into the Middle Ages, and right across Europe, people who expressed ideas that differed, even slightly from those of the church, tended to be invited to barbecues in the town square. The trouble was, of course, that they were the barbecue. So if he adapted pagan ideas, moulding them perhaps to a form that suggested the Christian viewpoint, well, they became less pagan, less evil, bringing them closer to what was seen as acceptable. A gloss of the true faith gave them a veneer of respectability, especially a suggestion that somehow the pagans had sensed the true beliefs that were to come from Christianity, such as the heaven and hell concept. It made pagans seem, well, less pagan, I suppose. Whether Snorri simply saw the Old Norse beliefs as a beautiful form of poetry and imagination, a wonderful art form, if you like, that should be preserved, or he was secretly a believer himself to some extent, I don't know. But either way, his additions and changes are understandable, if regrettable. And he contradicts himself too, as I've already mentioned, making hell out as miserable and gloomy, her realm a place of despair. Yet he also tells us how she decorates her hall and brews special mead to welcome distinguished arrivals in her realm. The two hardly compatible, almost as if he were giving a church-related version as well as popping in the correct version. In some ways, Hel, however you see her, was even more powerful than Odin, since once someone entered her realm, no one, not even the All-Father himself, could get them back again without her permission. She obeyed no one but herself. Her will was absolute in her own realm. There are stories of her that tell how she will ride out, mounted on her white three-legged horse, the Helhest or Hell Horse, seeking those who were ready to enter her realm during plagues or famines, gathering them in and taking them back with her. And presumably she will ride that same horse when she takes those residing in her realm to join the great battle of Ragnarok. Mind you, a three-legged horse wouldn't exactly give a comfortable ride. It would be sort of, it would move like a ship in a storm. It would sort of go that way, and it would go that way, and just like riding a bloody camel. Oh well. And, just as she could ride out, presumably, in times of plague and so forth, others could ride into hell. People who were not dead, as we see in the story of the death of Balder, where Hermod is sent by Odin to see if Hel will return Balder, taking Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir for the journey. After riding for 9 nights along the Helvig, the Hell Road, and traversing deep, dark valleys, he comes to the river Gnoll, and he crosses a bridge with a roof of gold that spans it. He is confronted by a woman named Mogr, a young woman, seemingly, given the word used to describe her, she being the guardian of the bridge. She asks him why he, who is clearly not dead, wishes to enter hell. He explains his mission, which ultimately fails, of course, and she allows him to proceed. Odin himself, also very much alive, visits hell to consult with a dead Volva, showing that even living persons could enter and leave again if they had sufficient reason to do so, and that hell could be reached reasonably easily from the realm of the living. Simply ride down and north along the road, cross the bridge, explain yourself to the guardian, and carry on. There was nothing that forbade visitors to hell's domain if they had sufficient reason to do so. Not that it was a particularly popular tourist resort, of course. There is an assumption, I think, that hell was a minor deity, relegated to a nasty and dismal task underground, worshipped by few, if any at all, and feared by all. But that is really the result of later Christian influence, seeing the old gods as representing either good or evil, and since death was something unpleasant, therefore hell was an evil goddess. Love was a nice thing, so Freya was a good goddess. But see, the pagans didn't see it that way. They didn't regard the gods as good or bad, or even the notion of good and bad as such as Christians did. They saw things as order and chaos, neither of them good or bad in themselves, but simply two natural and normal states of existence, made up of various aspects complementing each other, like the Chinese yin and yang. The gods representing aspects of life. Freya represented one aspect, hell represented another, an aspect that was an integral part of life. Death follows life just as night follows day. So they would not have seen her as some evil being who brought a nasty end to people's existence, but more as an admittedly dark, yet in her own way, a shining being coming to continue the circle of life, which is, a different way of looking at it. I think she would have been worshipped just as other gods were, though there are no actual mentions of that. In fact, possibly more so than many of the others. At least that seems to me to be logical. For one thing, your chances of coming face to face with Odin or Thor or Freya was pretty slim, after all. Odin wasn't going to let you throw a spear. Odin probably wasn't going to give you an apple. But you were most definitely going to meet Hel at some stage. Oh, yes. Everyone, highborn or peasant, noble or thrall, everyone was going to meet Hel at some time or another. So, worshipping her, to let you know how much you regarded her, that wasn't really a bad idea. She might remember you when you got there. I saw a question on a Facebook pagan site from someone who asked, was it safe to worship Hel, as they'd been told it wasn't a good idea. I suppose sort of based on the idea that you don't bring yourself to the attention of a death goddess just in case she might be short of the monthly quota at the time. I, of course, posted that Hel was not evil. She didn't bring death, it brought her. And worship of her was perfectly safe, since she didn't kill people whenever she fancied. She simply came for them when they died. So until your time to go came along, well, she wasn't going to bother you. On that point, I would be inclined to think that perhaps Thor and Hel were among the most worshipped of the gods, one being the protector of Midgard, where people lived, and the other the one they would all meet when they stopped living. And ceremonies to honor the dead and ask for their help and protection, of course, were common among the Norse. A blot or sacrifice to the dead was a normal practice and would have often involved Hel, since the dead they were appealing to and honoring resided in her realm and could do nothing without her permission. Such a blot would often be held beside the grave of one being honoured, perhaps on or close to one of the burial mounds, so common in Scandinavia, or at a crossroads, all places associated with death and Hel as its representative. And necromancy was a common practice. It survived in Iceland well into the Middle Ages, practiced by those who still followed the old gods, though probably they kept very quiet about that, given the chance of persecution by Christianity as it tightened its grip on Iceland. Now, when I say necromancy, I don't mean it in the sense of raising the dead from their graves to act as servants to the living. Zombies, climbing out of gaping holes in the ground, if you like. Brains. No. That's a later idea that really belongs in old Hollywood Bela Lugosi B movies. But as a way of merely contacting the dead to ask for their protection, as I've said, or for their wisdom, their guidance to the living, invoking Hel in the process, which they would have to do. Odin, for example, rides to Hel to raise a Volva from the dead and ask her for her wisdom, which he could only do with the consent of the goddess. Even Odin bowed to Hel in her own realm. I'm sure Hel would have been worshipped and invoked extensively. She would have been on a par at least with most of the other gods, but was transformed by Christian thinking into a minor goddess of evil, committing all sorts of nasty deeds in her woefully dismal hole in the ground. So how do I regard Hel? The goddess, that is, not the realm. Personally, I like her. I see her, as I'm sure would the Norse in ancient times, neither good nor bad, though she represents both qualities, since dying may be seen as a bad thing. Yet at the same time, it is also a good thing in cases where someone is in terrible pain, for example, when Hel could be a most welcome visitor, as I've mentioned already. Hel has a task to receive and to care for those who die, and that is what she does. There is nothing bad or evil about that. She does not kill people herself. She merely takes them when something else kills them. In that regard, she is no more evil than an undertaker. She has no responsibility for death itself. She does not choose how or why people die. And she is not, as I've said, goddess of death. She is the goddess of the dead, the custodian of those who are dead. She has no more to do with death itself than does the warden of a prison have to do with crime. He or she simply takes care of those who have committed it. In the context of Ragnarok, we may see Hel taking a more direct involvement with death itself, if she leads the dead out of her realm to join the battle. But in that scenario, everyone is taking sides at that time. Ron might start chucking people into the sea rather than waiting for ships to sink and drown them, or Idun might start throwing apples at the enemy, because I doubt she'd be very well practiced with a sword. Now here's the thing. Hel's leading the army of the dead out of her realm to join the great battle, Ragnarok, is usually shown as a clear indicator of her evil nature. She is leading her army out to bring death and destruction on a vast scale. But, can one blame Hel for siding with her father Loki and the anti-Odin forces? After all, her father, her brothers, and she herself have been abused by the gods. Her brother Narfi was killed by Voli after the gods turned him into a wolf and he tore his brother apart. Then Narfi had his guts ripped out to bind her father to a rock, who was then left in agony with snake venom dripping down on him. Fenrir was chained up, unable to move for many years. Hardly a very nice thing, and I'm sure it would upset the people who worry about being nice to animals. And Jormungandr was tossed into the sea, while Hel herself was told to look after the dead. There was no consultation with her on that duty. She wasn't asked, "You are now in charge of the dead, so off you go to Niflheim and be quick about it," sort of thing. Odin and the gods of Asgard had hardly endeared themselves to her, so her choice of which side to support, well, it seems rather an obvious one. Would anyone really expect her to side with Odin and the gods after what they had done to her entire family? It's seldom ever mentioned, but Loki's family was dreadfully abused by the gods, no matter their reasons for doing so. I've noticed quite a lot of comments from people elsewhere on YouTube and other sites that show perhaps a growing realization of Hel's true character, not her Christianized image as portrayed by Snorri, nor the annoyingly ludicrous presentation of her in that woeful Thor Ragnarok movie. Oh dear, 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 dear me. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. One saw her as welcoming, accepting all who came to her, seeing her like a mother taking her children home, while another regarded her as gentle, not evil or scary, a caring goddess. A nurse who had witnessed the suffering of dying patients saw her as the relief of that suffering, which is a good way of looking at it. And there are those who regard her as their favorite goddess, worshipping her in our own time and having altars dedicated to her, much like the one you sometimes catch a glimpse of in these videos. Mine is to Freuer, incidentally. Such views are more representative of the truth, I think, of how Hel would have been seen by the Norse peoples than the image of this evil, deformed hag glowering in a subterranean cavern of utter misery and despair. Yes. But though I call her goddess, is she in fact a full goddess, or merely a demigoddess, or perhaps not even that, just a queen? That is a debatable point, and I'll be looking at that aspect of her in part 3. So, until then, I shall say farewell and goodbye, and see you in part 3.